My son was buried 25 years ago, but last month I got a phone call from his number. They told me my son died 25 years ago. They said the fire left nothing behind. But last month, the phone I buried with him started ringing. When I answered, the voice I had mourned for 2 decades whispered that they were coming for me next. Now the truth is digging its way out of the grave, and I know my own life is hanging by a thread. My name is Evelyn Harper, and silence is the only permanent guest in this house. It settles in the corners of the high ceilings and gathers dust on the mantelpiece where the family portraits used to hang. Living in this sprawling estate on the desolate edge of the suburbs means the nights are absolute. There are no streetlights here to push back the dark, only the crushing weight of memory. It has been 25 years since the fire took Michael. People tell you that time heals, but they are liars. Time just adds layers of scar tissue over the wound. I still wake up smelling gasoline and smoke. I still see the charred metal of the car in my nightmares. My boy was only 18, and I never even got to see his face one last time. The coffin was sealed. They told me it was for my own good, that the body inside was unrecognizable. But that closed lid has haunted me every single day since. I keep this house in order because that is the only way I know how to survive. Every morning, the coffee is brewed at 6 o'clock sharp. The mail is sorted by category immediately upon arrival. Bills in the left slot. Personal correspondence in the right. I spent 3 decades as a floor manager at Greyline Logistics, ensuring that thousands of packages reached their destinations without a single error. You do not survive in that industry by being soft or forgetful. I know exactly where everything is in this house. I know when a coaster has been moved an inch to the left. Yet, my daughter tries to convince me that I am losing my grip. Abigail, my only living child. She drove up the driveway at noon today, just as she does every Sunday. Her husband, Derek, was behind the wheel of that expensive sedan they bought with money they do not really have. Abigail walked in, her eyes scanning the room not for dust, but for weakness. She hugged me, but her body was stiff. There is no warmth in her touch anymore, only assessment. She pulled back and looked at me with that practiced concern that makes my stomach turn. She tells me I am slipping. She tells me I repeat myself. She is building a narrative, brick by brick, that ends with me in a padded room. Derek did not waste time. He sat at the head of my dining table, spreading his papers out like he owned the mahogany. They come here for the roast beef, but they stay for the ambush. It is always the same conversation. They want me to sign the power of attorney. They talk about assisted living facilities with glossy brochures that feature smiling nurses and soft lighting. They talk about protecting my assets. But I know what they are really protecting. They want the deed to this house. They want the life insurance money Richard left me. I watched Derek tap his pen against the legal documents. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. We just want what is best for you. Evelyn, he said, you are getting confused lately. Remember last week you forgot where you put your keys? I had not forgotten. Derek had moved them. I saw him do it, sliding them into his pocket and then placing them on the fridge later. It is a cruel game they play, trying to chip away at my sanity so they can justify taking everything I have built. I refused to sign, just as I have for the last 6 months. I saw Abigail clench her jaw, the mask of the loving daughter slipping just enough to reveal the wolf underneath. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. They think I am a senile old woman waiting to die. They do not know that the grief hardened me like steel in a forge. I sat there, cutting my meat with precision, listening to the wind howl outside. It sounded different tonight. It sounded angry. The house groaned under the pressure of the coming storm. And for a moment, I felt a strange vibration in the floorboards. It was as if the ghosts of this family were waking up, tired of being quiet. I did not know it then, but the silence I had cultivated for 25 years was about to shatter. Something was coming for us, something buried deep, and no amount of legal papers or lies would be able to stop it. The fork in my hand hovered halfway to my mouth, suspended by a sudden, piercing sound that should have been impossible. It was a digital chirp, a simple, monophonic melody that cut through the tension of our dinner like a serrated blade. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I thought it might crack the bone. I knew that ringtone. It was the default setting on a Nokia 5110, a sound that belonged to the late 90s, not to a stormy Sunday evening 25 years later. Abigail dropped her napkin. Her eyes darted to the antique rosewood cabinet in the corner of the room, the one place in the house I strictly forbade anyone from touching. Derek stopped chewing, his jaw freezing mid-motion. For a second. The only sound in the room was that relentless, cheerful beeping coming from inside the locked cabinet. "That is just an old alarm clock," Derek said, his voice too loud, too sudden. "The batteries must be dying. It is malfunctioning." I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. "It is not an alarm clock," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That is Michael's phone." Abigail let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Mum, stop it. Michael's phone was buried with him. You told us that yourself. You are confusing things again. Sit down and eat your roast." I did not sit down. I walked toward the cabinet, driven by a terrified compulsion. I remembered the funeral clearly. I remembered the cold stiffness of the suit they had put Michael in. I remembered sliding that heavy brick of a phone into his breast pocket right before they closed the lid. It was an irrational, grief-stricken gesture. A mother wanting her child to have a way to call home if he got scared in the dark. It had been buried 6 feet underground for a quarter of a century. It should be crushed, corroded, dead. But it was ringing. I pulled the key from the chain around my neck and unlocked the cabinet door. Inside sat the small cedar box where I kept his baseball cards and his high school diploma. The sound was coming from inside the box. I lifted the lid. There, nestled among the yellowing papers, the grey plastic device was vibrating. The screen was glowing with that distinct, sickly green backlight. The pixelated black letters on the display formed a single name: Michael. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped it. I pressed the green button and lifted the heavy plastic to my ear. The line was filled with static, a white noise that sounded like wind howling through a tunnel. Then, a voice cut through the interference. It was faint, distorted, but I would know the pitch of my son's voice anywhere in this universe. "Mom, they are going to kill you." The words were whispered, urgent, terrifying. Before I could breathe, before I could scream, a hand snatched the device from my grip. Derek had crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed the phone, his fingers digging into the plastic, and jabbed his thumb down on the end button. The green light vanished. The room fell into a deafening silence. He threw the phone onto the carpet with a force that suggested he wanted to shatter it. "It is just a glitch." Derek spat out, his chest heaving. Old electronics do this. The circuits are fried. You are hallucinating voices. Evelyn. There was nobody on the line. I looked at him. Truly looked at him. I expected to see annoyance or pity, the usual masks he wore. But what I saw was panic. His face was pale, and a vein in his forehead was throbbing. Abigail was already pulling her smartphone from her purse, her fingers flying across the screen. "I am calling Dr. Langford," she announced, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "This has gone too far. You are hearing dead people on broken phones. Mother, we need an emergency evaluation. You are not safe here alone." I backed away until my spine hit the wall. They were acting out the script, the concerned daughter, the protective son-in-law, but the performance was fracturing. Derek was staring at the phone on the floor as if it were a venomous snake. Abigail refused to meet my eyes. They were not confused. They were not worried about my mental health. They were terrified because they had heard the ring too. They knew exactly what that phone call meant. And for the first time in 25 years, I realized that the monsters I feared were not ghosts haunting my house. They were standing right in front of me. Dr. Langford handed me the pills with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just to help you sleep." "Evelyn?" he said. His voice smooth like oil slicking over deep water. I looked at the 2 small blue tablets in his palm. They were strong sedatives, enough to knock a woman of my size out for 12 hours. I looked at Abigail, who was standing by the door, clutching her purse with white knuckles. She looked relieved. I placed the pills on my tongue, took a long sip of water, and swallowed air while sliding the tablets into the pocket of my cheek. It was an old trick I had learned from a rebellious employee at the warehouse years ago. I let my eyelids droop. I let my body sag against the cushions. I played the role of the exhausted, confused old woman perfectly. They waited until my breathing evened out before they left. As soon as the taillights of Abigail's sedan disappeared down the long driveway and the house settled back into darkness, I spat the dissolving bitterness into the kitchen sink and washed my mouth out with cold tap water. My hands were steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I went back to the living room. Derek had kicked the phone under the heavy velvet armchair in his haste. I got down on my hands and knees, my joints popping in the silence, and fished it out. The screen was cracked, but the battery held. I sat at my desk, the command center where I had managed shipping routes for half a lifetime. I plugged the device into my old diagnostic reader, a piece of legacy tech I had kept from the Grey Line days. My personal server had caught the handshake signal when the phone rang. It was a habit I never broke. I tracked everything that entered or left my airspace. The log on my monitor was stark. Incoming call. Duration 11 seconds. Origin, a set of coordinates deep in the Absaroka range of Wyoming. I ran the geolocation. The pin dropped in the middle of nowhere, attached to a facility listed as the Redwood Asylum Research Center. But it was the metadata that made my blood run cold. The call had not originated from a standard cell tower. The signal tag identified the source as a generic interface port for heavy life support telemetry. My son's number was not assigned to a mobile phone anymore. It was hardwired into a machine. I left the computer humming and went to the wall, safe behind the painting in the study. Richard had been gone for 5 years, but I had never purged his private archives. I pulled out the dusty accordion folders labeled miscellaneous expenses. I started digging, my eyes scanning for patterns. It did not take long. A floor manager knows how to spot a discrepancy in the ledger. Starting 1 month after the funeral, there was a recurring wire transfer, $3,000 a month, then $4,000, then $6,000. The beneficiary was a holding company, Aurora Medical, the parent entity of Redwood Asylum. The memo line on every single check was identical patient 72, M, 72. That was the year Michael was born. M for Michael. The realization hit me harder than the grief ever had. Richard had not just been protecting me from the sight of a burnt body. He had been paying for it. He had been paying for silence. My husband, the man I trusted with my life, had been funding a prison for our son for 25 years. And if the payments had stopped when Richard died, that meant Abigail knew. She had been signing the checks for the last 5 years. I looked at the photo of Michael on my desk, the boy with the bright eyes who I thought had turned to ash. He was not dead. He was a prisoner in a medical nightmare, and my entire family was the warden. The gravel of my driveway crunched under tires at exactly 12:15 in the morning. I had not slept. I was sitting in the dark on the edge of my bed, fully dressed in my work boots and heavy coat, waiting. I knew they would come back. The greed I had seen in Derek's eyes was too urgent to wait for morning. I cracked my bedroom door open just an inch. The front door downstairs opened with the soft click of a key that Abigail should not have possessed. I heard their voices drifting up the stairwell, hushed but sharp. "We cannot wait for the court order." Derek hissed. "If she checks those logs again, we are finished. She is my mother." "Derek," Abigail whispered, though her voice lacked any real hesitation. "She is a liability." He shot back. "The facility in Nevada has a bed ready. Once we give her the injection, she will be too disoriented to refuse transport. By the time she wakes up, she will be 1,000 miles away and deemed mentally incompetent." My blood ran cold. They were not just stealing my money, they were erasing me. I heard their footsteps on the stairs. They were coming for me. I quietly locked the bedroom door and engaged the deadbolt I had installed myself years ago. It would buy me 2 minutes, maybe 3. I did not go for the window in my room. It was a straight drop to the concrete patio. Instead, I moved to the adjoining storage closet. It was a narrow space where I kept seasonal linens, but it had a small ventilation hatch that opened onto the roof of the garage. The doorknob rattled violently. Evelyn Derrick shouted. "Open the door." I ignored him and climbed onto the shelves. 30 years at Greyline Logistics had taught me how to distribute weight and find leverage in tight spaces. I pushed the hatch open and squeezed through, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I slid down the shingles of the garage roof, my boots finding traction on the grit, and dropped into the hydrangeas below. My knees screamed in protest, but I forced myself up. I did not take my car. They would track the sedan. I ran to the old barn at the back of the property where Richard's 1998 Ford pickup sat under a tarp. I prayed the battery had enough charge. I turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. I tore out of the back dirt road without turning on my headlights, disappearing into the tree line just as the lights in my bedroom flickered on. I drove for 2 hours straight to the city, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they cramped. I arrived at Jonathan Pierce's townhouse at 3 in the morning. He was Richard's oldest friend and the only lawyer I trusted. When he opened the door in his robe, looking confused and terrified, I pushed past him. "I need to see the trust fund records." "Jonathan," I said. "Now." We sat in his study under the glow of a green desk lamp. Jonathan was trembling as he pulled the physical files for the Michael Harper Memorial Fund. "It is empty. Evelyn," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. I tried to tell Richard it was reckless. The fund had over $2 million in it 10 years ago. It was all liquidated. "Show me where it went," I demanded. He laid out the transaction history. It was not a lump sum withdrawal. It was a slow bleed. Monthly payments of $6,000, then $8,000, escalating over 2 decades. The recipient was always the same. Aurora Medical. I slammed my hand on the table. That is the parent company of Redwood Asylum. Jonathan looked pale. There is more. When Richard died 5 years ago, the payments from the trust stopped because the money was gone. But look here. He pointed to a new set of transfers starting the very next month. They did not come from Richard's estate. They came from a private account under the name of Abigail Monroe. The air left my lungs. Abigail. My daughter had not just stumbled upon this secret. She had inherited it. She had been paying to keep her brother in a cage for 5 years while telling me he was ash in a cemetery. She knew. She had looked me in the eye every Sunday, eaten my food, and lied to my face while signing checks to keep Michael buried alive. I stood up, grabbing the file. Jonathan reached for his phone. "Evelyn, I am calling the police. This is kidnapping. This is fraud." "No," I said, stopping his hand. "The police take reports. They file paperwork. They follow jurisdiction. By the time they get a warrant, Derek will have Michael moved or killed. They are desperate." "Jonathan." I walked to the door, the file tucked under my arm. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I am going to Wyoming," I said. "I am going to get my son back." I parked the rusted pickup truck 2 miles down the logging road and covered the remaining distance on foot. The wind in the Wyoming mountains cut through my coat like a knife, but the cold kept my mind sharp. I had spent $40 at a roadside thrift store on a grey jumpsuit and a clipboard, the universal uniform of the invisible worker. I lay flat in the brush near the service entrance, watching the perimeter for an hour. Redwood Asylum did not look like a place of healing. It looked like a fortress designed to keep secrets in and the world out. The fences were 12 feet high and topped with coils of razor wire that hummed with high-voltage electricity. The guards patrolling the perimeter were not rent-a-cops. They carried automatic rifles and walked with military precision. At 10 o'clock, a heavy supply truck rumbled up the switchback road. This was my window. I knew how these logistics operations worked better than anyone inside that building. During the chaos of unloading, there is always a blind spot between the dock and the inventory manager. I slipped out of the tree line, timing my movement with the hiss of the truck's air brakes. I walked straight to the loading bay with my head down and my clipboard held high, projecting the bored confidence of a vendor checking a manifest. No one stopped me. No one even looked at me. I was just another grey shadow in a grey building. Once inside, I ditched the outer layer of the jumpsuit and blended in with the scrub-wearing staff moving through the corridors. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and industrial antiseptic. My eyes scanned the directional placards on the walls. I was looking for Wing Delta. The log data from the phone call had been specific. I moved deeper into the facility, past the general wards and administrative offices, until the linoleum floor changed from white to a warning red. A heavy steel door blocked the hallway, labelled Restricted Access. I waited in a supply closet for 20 minutes until a weary-looking orderly swiped his badge to exit. I caught the door before the magnetic lock re-engaged and slipped inside. Wing Delta was silent, suffocatingly so. The air here was colder, and the hum of machinery replaced the sound of human voices. I crept along the wall, counting the room numbers. I froze when I heard voices drifting from an open office door ahead. "He is deteriorating fast," a male voice said. "Patient 72M is barely processing nutrients. The atrophy is total. We keep him alive until the payment clears on the 1st. Another voice replied, cold and dismissive. "If the family stops paying, we pull the support. It is that simple." I pressed a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. They were talking about my son like he was a subscription service that was about to expire. I waited for them to move down the hall before I stepped out. Room 72 was at the end of the corridor. The window in the door was small and reinforced with wire mesh. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped into the gloom. The only light came from the blinking monitors stacked on a metal cart. The room smelled of ozone and sickness. In the center of the room lay a bed with railings raised high on both sides. A figure lay beneath a thin sheet, hooked up to a ventilator that hissed rhythmically. I walked to the bedside, my legs trembling so hard I thought they would give out. I reached out and touched the hand resting on the sheet. The skin was paper-thin and cold. I looked at his face. The left side of his face was a map of jagged, shiny scar tissue. The brutal legacy of the fire I had been told killed him. But the right side was untouched. I brushed the hair back from his forehead. He looked older, gaunt and broken, but the structure of the jaw was the same. The shape of the ear was the same. His eyelids fluttered. I held my breath. Slowly, painfully. He opened his eyes. They were hazy with medication, but they were the same deep hazel eyes I had looked into the day he was born. He blinked, trying to focus on my face. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by a surge of panic that made the heart monitor speed up its beeping. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. I grabbed a cup of water with a straw from the table and guided it to his lips. He took a small sip and swallowed with difficulty. "Mom," he rasped. The voice was wrecked, unused for years, but it was his. I gripped his hand, tears finally spilling over my cheeks. "I am here. Michael, I am here." He squeezed my hand with a weak, desperate strength. "You have to go," he whispered. "They told me you were dead. They said if I tried to leave, they would kill you." I shook my head fiercely. "They lied to us. Michael. They lied about everything." He looked at the door, terror widening his eyes. "They think I died in that car. Mum, they want to keep me here forever. You have to run." I leaned down and kissed his forehead, right over the scar. "I am not running anywhere without you. We are going home." "I need you to listen to me," Michael said, his voice gaining a fragile strength that defied his physical state. "I was not driving that night. Mum. I was in the passenger seat." The words hit me like a physical blow. For 25 years, I had carried the shame that my son was a reckless boy who lost control on a rainy curve. I had defended his memory against neighbors who whispered that he was a danger to society. Who was driving? I asked, though deep down, the sick feeling in my gut told me I already knew the answer. "It was Derek," Michael whispered. "He was drunk. He was showing off for Abigail. We hit someone. Mom. A girl walking on the shoulder. She died instantly." The room spun. Derek. The man who sat at my table every Sunday. The man who carved the turkey and asked about my health. The man who had thrown the phone across the room just 24 hours ago. Michael continued, tears leaking from his scarred eyes. Abigail was following us in her car. She called Dad. When he got there, they made a choice. Derek had a scholarship to law school. Derek had a future. I was just the screw-up with bad grades. They decided that one life ruined was better than two. I listened in horror as my son described the betrayal that broke our family. Richard, my husband, the man I had slept beside for 40 years, had dragged Derek from the driver's seat. They had poured whiskey on Michael's clothes to make the toxicology report match their lie. They staged the scene, and when the fuel line ruptured and the sparks flew, they stood back. They watched the car burn with Michael trapped inside because a dead son was easier to handle than a murderer for a son-in-law. I screamed for them. Michael choked out, his grip on my hand tightening. I saw Dad turn away. They left me to burn. Mum, why? I sobbed, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. Why did you never call? Why did you let me think you were gone? Because they told me you would die if I spoke, Michael said, his eyes locking onto mine. Dad came here once, right after the first set of surgeries. He told me that the police would charge you as an accomplice if the truth ever came out. He said he was protecting the family. He said I had to stay dead to keep you safe. Richard. My Richard. He had not been protecting me. He had been protecting Abigail and Derek. He had sacrificed his own son to cover up a vehicular manslaughter charge for his daughter's boyfriend. The checks, the secrecy, the closed casket. It was all a wall built to hide their sins, and they had used my grief as the mortar to hold it together. Richard had lived his life convincing himself he was a pragmatic patriarch. But he was nothing more than a monster who chose his reputation over his child's life. When Dad died, Michael said, his breath hitching, Abigail came. She did not come to visit. She came to remind the doctors that I was just a number, patient 72M. She kept paying the bills not because she cared, but because she was terrified. But last week, she came back with Derek. I heard them talking outside the door. I wiped the tears from my face, my sorrow hardening into a cold, diamond-hard rage. They are out of money, aren't they? I asked. Michael nodded weakly. The trust is gone. Derek said it costs too much to keep a ghost alive. They told the doctor to stop the treatments. They are just waiting for my heart to stop so they can finally sleep at night. I stood up. The trembling in my hands had stopped. The mother who had mourned for a quarter of a century was dead. In her place stood a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. They made a mistake, I said, smoothing the hair back from his forehead. They forgot that I am still your mother, and I am going to burn their world down, just like they tried to burn you. The red strobe light above the door began to pulse a fraction of a second before the siren screamed into life. It was a high-pitched, digital wail that signaled a perimeter breach. They knew we were there. I did not waste a second. I ripped the sensors off Michael's chest and pulled the IV needle from his arm, ignoring the bead of blood that bloomed on his pale skin. He groaned, his legs buckling as I hauled him off the bed. But I shoved my shoulder under his armpit and hoisted him up. He was terrifyingly light, a skeleton draped in skin, but adrenaline gave me the strength of 10 women. We are leaving. Michael, I said, my voice hard and steady. Keep your feet moving. I did not head back the way I came. I had memorized the evacuation schematic mounted on the wall near the nurses' station. The main corridors would be swarming with security within 60 seconds. I dragged Michael toward the east service wing, moving through the shadows of the linen closets. The sound of heavy boots thundered on the linoleum behind us, followed by the crackle of radios. "Stop them!" a voice shouted from the far end of the hall. "They are heading for the waste disposal exit." We turned the corner and hit a dead end. The service door was reinforced steel, secured by an industrial magnetic lock. Michael slumped against the wall, gasping for air. "Mum," he wheezed. "It is locked. We are trapped. I am not done yet." I snapped. I spent 30 years managing warehouses where electronic locks malfunctioned daily. I pulled a thin, flat piece of steel I had pried from the clipboard earlier out of my pocket. I jammed it into the gap between the doorframe and the magnetic plate, finding the override latch used for power failures. It took a precise, violent twist that nearly broke my wrist, but the mechanism clicked. The magnet disengaged with a heavy thud. I kicked the door open, and the world instantly turned white. A blizzard had descended on the mountain while I was inside. The wind roared like a jet engine, driving snow into our faces with stinging force. The cold was brutal, instantly biting through Michael's thin hospital gown. I wrapped my coat around him, dragging him through the knee-deep drifts toward the loading dock. A medical supply van was idling near the gate, its exhaust pumping grey clouds into the white air. The driver, a heavy-set man in a thick parka, was standing by the rear doors, looking confused by the alarms. I did not hesitate. I pulled a heavy metal wrench from my belt, something I had swiped from the maintenance cart in the hallway, and marched right up to him. "Get in the truck," I ordered, swinging the wrench with enough intent to show him I was not bluffing. "Drive us out of here. Now." He saw the look in my eyes, the look of a cornered animal, and threw his hands up. He scrambled into the driver's seat. I shoved Michael into the passenger side and squeezed in beside him, jamming the wrench against the driver's ribs. "Go!" I yelled. The truck fishtailed out of the compound just as 3 black SUVs tore around the corner of the building. Gunfire popped behind us, the sound dull and flat against the howling wind. The rear window of the van shattered, showering us in safety glass. "Drive faster," I screamed. The driver floored it. We careened down the winding mountain road, the tires struggling for grip on the black ice. The SUVs were gaining on us, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow like predator eyes. They were reckless, bumping our rear bumper, trying to spin us out. I looked at Michael. He was clutching the dashboard, his face terrified but alive. For the first time in 25 years, he was outside. Suddenly, the lead SUV clipped our back tire on a hairpin turn. The van lurched violently to the right. The driver screamed as the wheels spun out of his hands. We hit the guardrail, metal screeching against metal, and then the world flipped. We tumbled into the dark ravine. The crash was a chaos of noise and breaking glass. I felt a rib snap, and then everything went black. I woke up to the taste of blood and the feeling of freezing snow on my face. The van was on its side, crushed against a massive pine tree. The driver was gone, likely thrown clear or fled. I dragged myself over the center console. "Michael!" I choked out. He was pinned under the dashboard, unconscious but breathing. I heard voices shouting above us on the road, but they were distant, drowned out by the storm. Then, a beam of light cut through the trees. It was not the tactical light of a mercenary. It was the warm, yellow beam of a heavy-duty flashlight. "Over here?" A voice called out. I see the wreckage. Two figures in thick green parkas slid down the embankment. Park rangers. They pried the door open and pulled me out, their faces grim but kind. We have survivors. One of them shouted into his radio. Two of them. Get the medevac ready at the lower clearing. I grabbed the ranger's jacket, my hands bloody and freezing. My son, I whispered, pointing into the wreck. Please, save my son. As they pulled Michael from the twisted metal, the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks, burying the asylum, and burying the past. We were broken, bleeding, and freezing. But as the ranger loaded us onto the sled, I looked up at the stormy sky and knew one thing. We were free. The fluorescent lights of the county hospital were harsh, stripping away every shadow. But for the first time in decades, I welcomed the clarity. The attending physician, a young man with tired eyes, walked into the room holding a clipboard. He looked from me to the gaunt man in the bed beside me. The DNA markers are a match, he said, his voice thick with disbelief. This is Michael Harper. With those 4 words, the lie that had held my life hostage for 25 years finally crumbled. Michael was no longer a ghost or a medical code. He was a citizen again, and the law was about to descend on the people who had stolen his life. Jonathan Pierce met me in the hospital waiting room, flanked by 2 federal agents. I handed over the water-damaged file folder I had salvaged from the wreck. It contained the admission logs, the payment history, and the internal memos from Redwood Asylum detailing the deliberate withholding of physical therapy to keep patient 72M invalid. The agents read the documents in silence. The evidence was not just circumstantial. It was a meticulously documented roadmap of cruelty. But the final nail in the coffin came from the grave itself. Among the financial records I had taken from my husband's safe was a small, micro-cassette tape labelled simply with the date of his death. I had been too afraid to play it before, but sitting in that hospital room, I clicked it into the recorder Jonathan provided. Richard's voice, weak and rattling with the cancer that killed him, filled the room. He confessed everything. He spoke of the rainy night, the girl dying on the road, and the decision to sacrifice Michael to save Derek's future. He admitted that he had set up the trust fund not as a memorial, but as a payroll for the prison guards at Redwood. He sounded pathetic, a man trying to bargain with God, but to the FBI agents, it was a confession to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Abigail did not go down quietly. She arrived at the hospital with her lawyer, demanding custody of her brother and claiming I was having a psychotic break. She stood in the hallway, screaming that I was a danger to myself and others, that I had kidnapped a patient from a secure facility. She played the part of the concerned daughter perfectly, tears streaming down her face, urging the officers to detain me for a 72-hour psychiatric hold. It was her last card to play. If she could prove I was insane, she could bury my testimony and regain control over Michael. The FBI called in a state psychiatrist immediately. I sat through 3 hours of evaluation. I answered every question with the cold, hard precision of a woman who had managed logistics for 30 years. I recited dates, names, financial figures, and the exact timeline of the crimes committed against my family. When the psychiatrist emerged, he looked at Abigail and shook his head. Mrs. Harper is fully cogent, he declared. She is oriented, rational, and telling the truth. The colour drained from Abigail's face. She realized then that the narrative she had built was gone. The federal investigation moved with terrifying speed after that. The agents froze the joint accounts Abigail shared with Derek. They subpoenaed the bank records of the Michael Harper Memorial Fund. The forensic accountants traced every single dollar from Richard's estate to the shell company, Aurora Medical. They found the transfers Abigail had made from her own accounts after the trust fund ran dry, proving she was complicit in the ongoing imprisonment of her brother. The evidence connected them to charges of medical abuse, false imprisonment, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. I stood by the window of Michael's hospital room, watching the police cruisers gather below. Derek had been picked up at his law firm an hour ago. Abigail was being questioned in the lobby. They thought they could erase us. They thought money and influence could rewrite reality. But they forgot that the truth is like a seed. Bury it deep enough, and it eventually grows toward the light. I turned back to look at my son, who was finally sleeping without the aid of sedatives. The private war was over, but the public battle was just beginning. I was not just going to send them to prison. I was going to stand in front of the world and tell them exactly what happens when you cross a mother who has nothing left to lose. Abigail decided to play her final card on a Tuesday night, with the rumors of the investigation beginning to leak into the tabloids. She organized a gala at the Grandview Hotel, billing it as the 25th anniversary memorial for Michael Harper. It was a desperate, audacious move designed to curry public sympathy and paint herself as the grieving sister before the indictment could drop. She stood on the stage in a black silk dress, bathed in a soft spotlight, wiping away tears that were as fake as the eulogy she was delivering.